You are listening to the Keeping It Juicy podcast,
your main squeeze in nutrition.
Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon on YouTube so you can get notified every Tuesday when we upload a new episode.
You can also add us on Facebook and Instagram at Keeping It Juicy Podcast.
Welcome to episode 32, everybody.
Oh yeah, welcome to this new episode of how to get a metabolic syndrome.
Right, so we're going to be talking all about metabolic syndrome in this episode, and stay tuned because we will be announcing the winner of the giveaway.
Oh yeah, so don't go anywhere, please. So before we do get into before we go into the actual context of the episode, let's do our new nutrition in the news. So this new nutrition in the news, I came across it when I was watching a webinar for, of course, my continuing education credit on intermittent fasting. And one of the important things that they did bring up was, I never knew about this, but there was a relationship between intermittent fasting and chemotherapy radiation, which the study that we're about to talk about now is slightly different from the one that I actually went over in that webinar, just because I can't find my actual show notes. But the study itself actually examined whether fasting produces any cancer-fighting effects in mice stem cells. I bring up this study just because I did attend the webinar, but it's important to note that stem cells are important due to the regenerative abilities in this context. The researchers reveal that fasting for 2 to 4 days may protect these stem cells against the negative effects of chemotherapy on the immune system, which is very important. And this active fasting also activates stem cells of the immune system to help renew and repair themselves a lot better. So it shows that not only does it reduce damage to the actual cells, it actually replenishes white blood cells and replaces damaged ones. So if you guys don't know, white blood cells fight infection and destroy cells that may cause disease. When white blood cell levels drop as a result of chemotherapy, it's going to affect that immune system negatively. This means that the body is going to have a harder time fighting against infections, etc. So the number of white blood cells in the body decreases during fasting. However, when the fasting cycle ends, the body actually receives food, white blood cell levels increase again. So in the webinar itself, it was talking about how it wasn't a randomized study, so keep that in mind, but it was a small group of people, and then they did this fasting aspect with these people that were about to go through chemotherapy, and they had them fast, and they ended up showing symptoms that allowed them to go through the chemotherapy a lot better compared to those that did not fast, because for some reason starving those cells helped them go through the chemotherapy a lot better. So
it's interesting.
So
typically when you're going through like chemotherapy, your energy intake needs to be higher to, provide your body with sufficient calories to like just function in general, because you are so compromised. So do you know if in this study, yes, they were fasting for potentially 2 to 4 days. On the days they did eat, I'm assuming their energy intake was much higher than average to offset that, or was it still?
Unfortunately, the study did not go into that much detail.
Yeah.
It only really talked about the fasting aspect of it and how the patients felt after chemotherapy versus when they didn't fast. So they were able to tolerate chemotherapy better.
I mean, it's definitely interesting, and it, in some ways it makes sense, and in my mind, in some ways it doesn't. It makes sense in the sense of, your body cells need calories and energy to survive, and cancer cells are no different. When you starve the body of energy, the weakest ones will die off. And same with like animals in the jungle and stuff. Like the old and the weak are the ones that die off. So your body has a very similar mechanism. And I think fasting definitely stimulates kind of that primal, instinct that our bodies have to kill off the old or the weak cells. And yes, stem cells will like go into that area. And if you guys don't know, stem cells will basically, they kind of have the ability to turn into whatever they need to turn into. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So just thought I'd bring that up since we did talk about intermittent fasting a couple episodes ago, and I just happened to go through a webinar about it.
And to build on that too, I mean, there is still emerging research that keto diets are being not tested, but they're being studied in cancer. And again, it all goes back to fuel source and cells, and glucose is the preferred fuel source. And if you get rid of glucose, your cells are forced to learn how to use a different energy source. And in that process, cancer cells can die or be starved or be weakened, which allows other therapies to be more effective. So more research is emerging, so we'll see.
Yeah.
We will see. So now let's jump into the bulk of our episode, which is metabolic syndrome. So first, let's talk about what it is. So metabolic syndrome is also known as syndrome X. You might hear that term thrown around sometimes. I've heard it more as metabolic syndrome. And it's basically a cluster of the following medical conditions. It can be some, it can be all. We'll get into that a little bit later. But it's basically composed of central obesity, so this is abdominal fat, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high serum triglycerides, and low serum HDL. That's your high density lipoprotein. That's the healthy, the good one, in comparison to the LDL. And the American Heart Association, so the AHA, and the World Health Organization, so the WHO, have different criteria. So according to the American Heart Association guidelines, any 3 of the following traits in the same person they'll be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. So these are the 5 traits. If you have 3, according to the AHA, you have metabolic syndrome. So the first one is abdominal obesity. So basically a waist circumference over 102 centimeters or 40 inches in men, and then 88 centimeters or 35 inches in women. Second criteria is serum triglycerides, so 150 milligrams per deciliter or above, and taking medication for elevated triglycerides. That's just kind of total cholesterol. And then for the HDL, so your good cholesterol, 40 or lower in men and 50 or lower in women. And then if you have high blood pressure, and their criteria is 130 over 85 or above, or if you're taking medication. And then the last possible criteria is a fasting blood glucose of 100 or above.
Right. And on the contrary part, you have the World Health Organization, who have a slightly different criteria for defining the metabolic syndrome. So first off, you have high insulin levels, and elevated fasting blood glucose, or an elevated post-meal glucose alone, with 2 of the following criteria. As what?
So you have to have that one, the first one, and then 2 of the next 3.
Right. So the next one is abdominal obesity, as mentioned before, as defined by a waist-to-hip ratio of greater than 0.9. If you don't know all about that, please refer to our previous episode about obesity. And a body mass index of at least 30 kilograms per meter squared, or waist measurement of over 37 inches. And then also cholesterol panel showing a triglyceride level of at least 150 milligrams per deciliter, or an HDL cholesterol lower than 35 milligrams per deciliter. And last but not least, blood pressure of 130 over 80 or higher, or on treatment for higher blood pressure. So metabolic syndrome is associated with the risk of developing cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. if those parameters weren't already met. So in the US, about a quarter of the adult population do have metabolic syndrome, and the prevalence actually increases with age, with racial and ethnic minorities being particularly affected. And this is about 3 million Americans that probably have this condition, and obviously this did not happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't.
And it's tricky because the criteria are, they're similar, but they're different between
Right.
the WHO and AHA. So, but they kind of follow the same trend. So it's basically, a lot of abdominal fat, dyslipidemia, and insulin resistance are kind of the main, like, cornerstones to metabolic syndrome.
Right.
When it comes to the specifics of, what does your blood test have to be, or what does your waist circumference have to be, that varies slightly. Like WHO doesn't distinguish between men and women, whereas the AHA does. But still, it's still abdominal obesity. So,
right.
So let's move on to what metabolic syndrome does. So again, it's defined by a combination of interconnected physiological, biochemical, clinical, and metabolic factors that directly increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, which we talked about last week, and all-cause mortality. Basically, just death, like dying in general. If you don't know what all-cause mortality means, it's just risk of dying, which we all are going to die, but it
increases your risk of dying earlier. Let's say that.
And and all-cause meaning like nothing specific, like it could just in general.
Right.
So I do just want to address what cardiovascular disease actually is, because we haven't had a specific episode on that. So according to the AHA, cardiovascular disease can be narrowing of the blood vessels, and this is like plaque buildup inside, which is also called atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, heart failure, arrhythmia, which is like irregular heartbeat, and heart valve problems. So again, that's according to the AHA what cardiovascular disease is. But I do want to point out that not all cardiovascular diseases are dietary or lifestyle related. So you can actually be born with heart valve problems. Some people are born with heart valves that don't open all the way, or they're too small. So that can lead to problems. So just because you have cardiovascular disease doesn't necessarily mean like you have horrible diet and horrible exercise. Usually it does. But I just want you to keep in mind not to be like judgmental if someone says they have cardiovascular disease and they could have been born. It's called congenital factors. My aunt, for example, she got some weird like food poisoning where the bacteria got to her heart and gave her cardiovascular disease. So weird things can happen. So just keep that in mind. Like just because they have cardiovascular disease doesn't necessarily mean like, oh my gosh, you're horrible. So about half of those with metabolic syndrome have some form of cardiovascular disease.
Right. So metabolic syndrome is also associated with chronic inflammation, which is directly associated with visceral obesity and insulin resistance, which is characterized by production of abnormal adipose cytokines. So this is a general blanket term for a bioactive product produced by your adipose tissues. So this can include tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1, interleukin-6, leptin, and adiponectin. The interaction between these components of the clinical phenotype of this particular syndrome with its biological phenotype, aka insulin resistance, dyslipidemia. This relationship contributes to the development of this pro-inflammatory state, and it furthers a chronic and subclinical further inflammation. Like our body's just inflamed all the time. That's what it's basically doing. And this
that was a mouthful.
Like bear with me, like long story short, you're just inflamed all the time. So there's a huge relationship between the basically stuff going on in your adipose tissue and the insulin resistance and all that good stuff.
And we talked about some of the dangers of excessive body fat in a different episode. And the main point is fat doesn't just like sit there and store calories. It produces a lot of different hormones and just compounds and things like that. And not only that, like it's hard on your joints and all that stuff, but you know, TNF, leptin, all of those things, like they screw with your hormones. Like hormones, the point of hormones is to be released and then cause like a chain reaction and like a waterfall effect. Like hormones trigger other things. So when you have this weird circulation of hormones from excessive body fat, you're going to have some clinical issues that follow. So it's kind of the point there. So let's talk about how you get it. So primarily from obesity or excessive body fat, especially around your abdominal area. But I do want to point out, not everyone who is obese will get metabolic syndrome, but everyone with metabolic syndrome is likely obese. Again, we've talked many times about how obesity is a BMI category. That's kind of outdated. So I'd rather focus on excessive body fat, especially in the abdominal region. So it's not always a 100% cause and effect, but there definitely is a strong relationship and correlation. So metabolic syndrome is present in only about 5% of people with a normal body weight. So that's normal in terms of the BMI categories. The overweight category, 22% of those individuals have metabolic syndrome. And then in the obese category, 60% of people have metabolic syndrome. So as you can see, as your BMI is higher, you're more likely to have metabolic syndrome. It's not 100% by any means, but I wonder, I didn't find the statistic, but you know, in the morbidly obese category 1 and 2, logic tells us it's just going to be higher. And then a study stated that adults who continue to gain 5 or more pounds per year raise their risk of developing metabolic syndrome by up to 45%. So those 5 pounds every year make a big difference. Big difference.
So another thing to point out is waist circumference is also a very strong indicator as well. And also some degree of insulin resistance does point towards metabolic syndrome. Also, definitely very important is stress. So the hormonal balance of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is very important. So basically extremely high or unstable cortisol can result in increased glucose and insulin levels, which can promote that visceral adiposity that you see around that central area. And other factors that are included are diet, specifically sugar-sweetened beverages, so your juices, your sodas, and all that good stuff, and aging post-menopausal women as well, genetics, aging, sedentary lifestyle, or just low physical activity, and chronic lack of sleep, which we'll get into that later, medication and alcohol abuse, smoking, and mood disorders. So all that fun stuff.
So many of those things are so interrelated. Like if you're abusing alcohol, you probably have lack of sleep, which leads to more cortisol, which leads to higher abdominal fat, which leads to higher waist circumference. So
our body is just so complicated, and I just love it.
It's just so many, and low physical activity is related to, you know, central obesity. Sugar-sweetened beverages are related to central obesity. So a lot of these things are very interrelated, but not necessarily complete cause and effect relationships. But I think we know the gist of what the problem is here. So let's talk about how you fix it. So lifestyle modification remains the, you know, gold standard and the initial intervention for this metabolic syndrome. So the way we kind of go about it, just combining a nutritious, balanced diet with exercise and behavioral strategies. like medical treatment and taking medications should be considered for those with risk factors that are not adequately reduced with lifestyle change. So lifestyle change first, nutrition first, physical activity first. Sleep, yeah, exactly. And then if you can't do that, I mean, I don't want anyone to take medication, but if things are severe, your doctor will more than likely recommend something for blood pressure or insulin or whatever, but lifestyle first.
Lifestyle first. So last but not, well, definitely not last. I do want to go into this fun study. I said a fun study. So basically, so I did do a poster presentation back in 2017 at the Texas Academy of Nutrition Dietetics in Georgetown. And it was actually involved in the use of melatonin and the metabolic syndrome. So let's kind of talk about how these are kind of involved with each other. So let me just break it down. So as we all know, altered eating habits and decreased physical activity can contribute to these metabolic abnormalities that we've already talked about. So with that being said, there is something called the circadian rhythm. If you're not familiar, that's our internal clock. That has actually demonstrated a relationship with our body's metabolic processes. So not that our body isn't complicated enough. So this circadian rhythm actually produces melatonin secretion in order to maintain our internal homeostasis, which affects our eating habits, our eating times, our amount of activity, resting, and our fasting. So basically how we mobilize fat, how we mobilize energy, how we store energy, and how we expend energy. So it is important to note that less sleep also equates to less melatonin secretion. So just one thing leads to the other. So now that we went into that, I kind of went into the rabbit hole of research in this presentation, and I saw that there was so much increased research into melatonin as a nutrition supplement to help suppress the effects of metabolic syndrome, weight loss potential noted as well. It does play a role. It's supposed to play a role in our insulin signaling pathway. And if you're not too familiar with that, refer to our diabetes episode, and our vascular reactivity. So basically how big and small our vessels get in our bodies. So long story
like vasoconstriction and vasodilation?
Yes.
Or are you talking about like plaque buildup or both?
The first one.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Cool.
So long story short, I went through a handful of studies after I put in, as part of my class, I put in inclusion and exclusion criteria, of course, where I had to like exclude like different types of studies based on like how biased they were and how many, just for a whole variety of reasons. And it came down to, there was a lot of studies on rats, and the only human studies was on pregnant women. I do not know why.
That's not a good population.
No, but they did pregnant women. Like you would think they would do regular people first and then move on to pregnant women, but like
things just aren't normal during pregnancy. So why would you choose that population?
I would assume just because they get that lack of sleep anyways. That's why they did it, but these women also agreed to it, so they don't know. But long story short, they all did support, surprisingly, that role of melatonin within that insulin signaling pathway and the glucose uptake. So basically, our body has melatonin receptors. We excrete melatonin, and then we have the receptors. And when you take out that receptor, basically this causes insulin resistance and glucose uptake, which they're still trying to research into that pathway and how it correlates between the two, but that's just something that they found was happening. And I do want to point out, like, even though melatonin does have this support and it shows something promising, the research is still limited. Like a lot of the research studies I found, well, first off, it was not a lot. but and a lot of it was more recent anyways. But it is definitely a promising start. Does that mean you should start taking a melatonin supplement? No. If you have no problem sleeping, no.
Right. I guess I'm just a little bit confused about how these receptors are related. I mean, are like if melatonin doesn't bind to these receptors because melatonin is, you know, being produced at weird times or whatever, or not in circulation at the right times, does that mean that the like insulin and glucose are wrong too? Or I guess I'm just a little bit
They're
confused.
still trying to research the whole pathway with that. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Like there was this one study that I'm looking at right now, which I'll probably attach to a PowerPoint that I had created. Of course, I'll like erase the identifying aspects of it.
Okay.
But so you guys can take a closer look. But that's just how it showed. There was this one study about rats where they basically knocked out some of the genes in rats. So one rat had all the melatonin receptors, one rat had only a couple of melatonin receptors. And there's actually two different kind of melatonin receptors, which, not to make it more confusing as it is, and they knocked out one of those genes for it, and another rat had no melatonin receptors. And as you got less and less melatonin receptors, you notice the studies show that there was more insulin resistance, and the rat with the less melatonin receptors was fatter, had insulin resistance, had more hypertension type of symptoms. So I just thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm almost wondering, like it's interesting that when they completely wiped out the gene for it, like melatonin is one of the very prominent pathways that are involved in our sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, like you mentioned. But there's, a few other things. But I'm just wondering, like, on nights that you don't get a good sleep, like your decision-making skills are bad, our hunger is usually bad, which leads to maybe bad, and it even leads to like lifestyle things too, like, oh crap, I overslept, I don't have time for breakfast, like that has nothing to do with my pathways, that has to do with my personal choice to hit snooze because I was tired. So
but with that being said, you're not getting that sleep and you're not getting that extra melatonin either.
Right, exactly, it's two parts.
Everything is thrown out of whack.
And even just your psychological thing too, like you stay up late. When you stay up late, you normally need to eat a little bit more because when you're awake longer hours, you need to eat more longer hours. So that could lead to a cascade of effects too.
It's just a domino effect. That's literally what it's pointing towards, because that's what I'm saying, that you shouldn't use melatonin as a solve-all thing. Obviously, you need to do lifestyle changes first before you're like, okay, maybe I can help supplement melatonin.
I would say too, like, just try to get a good night's sleep. get a bedtime routine, get a morning routine, and see how that works first.
Right.
So, cool. Very interesting.
All right. So we do want to lead off with our social media shout out of the week. So we did notice the hashtag, the Instagram handle is natural gas with an extra S. So natural.gas with an extra S. So she is a dietetic intern, I believe from California, and she has pictures of food and hiking adventures, and you basically can see her go through life as a dietetic intern.
Awesome.
So thank you for tuning in and supporting us. So check her out if you guys want to.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so now the time that you've all been waiting for, we are going to figure out who's going to win. So we're actually going to do this live.
Ooh. If we don't fuck up.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a random number generator. Let me share my screen so you guys can watch it in action. Can you see my screen?
Ooh, yes, I can.
Yeah. Let me make this bigger.
She's getting lit, guys.
Okay. So we have all of our entries.
Ooh.
And we had 32 people enter the giveaway. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see on my phone, I have randomly I'm going to generate between 1 and 32. So generate, it's 14. So we're going to find the 14th comment.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
You might need to just sip of tea doing
5,
that.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13,
Killing me.
14. Andrew,
Woo!
the OG Meerkat. Thank you. You've won the giveaway.
I actually like that Instagram handle right now. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for entering the giveaway. Thank you to everyone. We will definitely have more as we reach like milestones. Let me stop sharing my screen for a sec. Yeah, so we will definitely have more giveaways as we reach milestones, whether it's like, I don't know, maybe 100 YouTube subscribers or something, because that's the next big milestone, I guess, getting those first 100 subscribers. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube, we would really appreciate it. It helps us out. Leave us comments. It was really fun to see everyone share their support, because sometimes we don't know if you actually like what we have to say. So let us know.
Yeah, please let us know. And honestly, when we ask you guys how you feel and your thoughts about articles and things, we want to know.
We care.
Because we're nosy. We want to know.
We care about this stuff, okay? So yeah, it was really great to hear that you guys actually enjoy the show, because we enjoy making it for you guys too. Right. So thank you.
Thank you guys. That concludes episode 32.
32. Yeah. So we will be reaching out to OG Meerkat very soon. And be in contact with how you will receive your $50 Amazon gift card. So yeah, right. Thank you guys, and we will catch you in the next one.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Keeping It Juicy podcast.
Your main squeeze in nutrition.
Don't forget to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for a brand new episode.
Also, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Keeping It Juicy Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so please leave us a review.
5 stars, no less.
On whatever platform you're listening to, or send us an email at keepingitjuicypodcast@gmail.com.
Or if you have any topics you'd like for us to touch upon, shoot us an email. Until next time, don't do anything that I wouldn't do.